a shot of champagne. Anyway, I gotta tell you, I went...
He didn't knock. Johnny Carson burst through a side door onto a soundstage that wasn't even his, a camera crew trailing behind him, and pointed straight at the man holding the broken pieces of wood in his hand. "You broke it," Carson said. "And you're going to pay for it."
Then, how did the moon get out there? How did the star?
These are the 10 most unforgettable guests to ever sit on that famous couch beside Johnny Carson on The Tonight Show, and the encounters that turned ordinary weeknights into moments television never forgot. Most people remember Johnny Carson for the desk, the monologue, the golf swing he'd do before every commercial break.
26 years, walk away, it's over.
Yeah. What they don't always remember is that Carson's real genius was as a straight man, and the guests on this list are the ones who proved it, the ones who could make him break character, lose his composure, or sit completely still while a song undid him on national television.
Before you get the next green, keep that up until there's no more sand in the desert.
Tonight, we're going back through 30 years of The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson, October 1, 1962, to May 22, 1992, with Ed McMahon announcing every single night and Doc Severinsen leading the band to revisit 10 guests whose appearances became legend, a comic genius who arrived like a hurricane, a friendship that ended in a single phone call, and a farewell so emotional that NBC's own staff debated whether the show could simply end right there.
Wow, Dave's a lot better looking in person.
This isn't just a list of funny clips. It's the story of how one desk in Burbank, California, became the single most powerful stage in American entertainment, and the 10 guests who proved it. Every guest on this list earned their place the hard way by walking out from behind that curtain in Burbank, California, and simply refusing to be forgettable.
You know, it actually happened to me at a command performance. I don't know whether I told you this.
Let's start with the one even Johnny Carson admitted he couldn't keep up with. It was October 1981, and Robin Williams was already a star. Mork and Mindy had made him a household name 3 years earlier, and Hollywood was paying close attention to his first major film role, In the World According to Garp. But for all that visibility, Williams had almost never sat down for a major talk show interview. Carson's booker knew they were getting someone unpredictable, but nobody quite knew how unpredictable.
For a moment, I thought that was part of murder. I thought that was protocol.
For most performers, walking out to sit beside Johnny Carson was the single most controlled 5 minutes of their career, rehearsed, gauged, careful. Williams treated it like an invitation to chaos. He was barely seated before he started moving through characters like a radio scanning stations, a nervous evangelist, a stiff government spokesman, a joke about nerves wrapped inside a fake macho voice, and the band, the audience, and Carson himself had no idea what was coming next.
Yeah. What is this, book night?
Yeah.
Did he have a book too? That's a beautiful thing you did.
At one point Williams reached for Carson's own coffee mug, took a theatrical sip, and muttered through his teeth, "Relax, relax, relax, you're on TV." Carson, the most composed man in television, a host who could deliver a punchline without blinking, lost it completely.
Person there, and I don't mean to be cruel, I want to help. Did you ever feel that?
He put his hand over his face. His shoulders shook. For a few seconds, the most famous interviewer in America simply could not speak. The studio audience roared, and the bit became an instant piece of Tonight Show folklore, proof that whatever Williams was doing, it wasn't an act anyone could rehearse.
Terrific show, and I know that people are concerned about Dave.
His Tonight Show appearances throughout the 1980s only built on that reputation, each one less an interview than a controlled demolition of the format itself, and they helped accelerate Williams from sitcom star into one of the defining comic minds of his generation.
I said to him, I said, "Hey, buddy, who told you could play around my wife?" He said, "Everybody."
Carson kept inviting him back for the rest of the decade, fully aware he had no idea what he was inviting back. That's why we're still watching those clips today, decades later, because nobody, not even Johnny Carson, ever knew which Robin Williams was going to walk out from behind that curtain. But if Williams proved a guest could overwhelm Carson with pure improvisation, the next entry proved something else entirely, that the right insult, delivered by the right man, could turn Carson into the punchline of his own show.
For making this a very special night. Thank you, my friend.
On December 13, 1976, Don Rickles was a guest on The Tonight Show while Bob Newhart sat in as guest host. Rickles had been doing his insult comic routine on Carson's stage since 1965, becoming such a fixture that he would eventually appear on the show more than 100 times. That particular night, Rickles launched into a bit as a fake immigration officer, using the wooden cigarette box that had sat on Carson's desk since 1967 as an improvised rubber stamp. He slammed it down once. Then again, harder. And that's when the box and heirloom Carson genuinely treasured cracked apart in his hands. Rickles went into mock horror, but the audience barely registered what had actually happened. Carson, who was away from the show that night, had no idea his desk had a casualty until he came back the next evening and his bandleader broke the news on air. Carson didn't yell. He didn't even bring it up on his own show. Instead, broken box in hand, he grabbed a camera crew and marched directly into the next-door studio, where Rickles was mid-scene taping his own sitcom, and barged into frame demanding an explanation. Rickles, caught completely off guard, could only fire back, "Next Christmas I'm going to make sure a tree drops on your head." Rickles went into mock horror, but the audience barely registered what had actually happened. Carson, who was away from the show that night, had no idea his desk had a casualty until he came back the next evening and his bandleader broke the news on air. Carson didn't yell. He didn't even bring it up on his own show. Instead, broken box in hand, he grabbed a camera crew and marched directly into the next-door studio, where Rickles was mid-scene taping his own sitcom, and barged into frame demanding an explanation. Rickles, caught completely off guard, could only fire back, "Next Christmas I'm going to make sure a tree drops on your head." And if Rickles showed that Carson could dish it out as well as take it, the next guest revealed something rarer still, a comedian who turned decades of being overlooked into the single most quoted punchline in stand-up history. By the time Rodney Dangerfield walked onto the Tonight Show stage in the late 1960s, he had already spent nearly 2 decades trying and failing to make it as a comedian, quitting once, working a straight job to support his family, and starting over from nothing in his 40s. He was the furthest thing from an overnight success. What he had instead was one perfect joke, delivered with the exact right amount of defeated honesty: "I don't get no respect." Night after night, appearance after appearance throughout the 1970s, Dangerfield brought that single premise back to Carson's stage and somehow made it land harder every time, tugging at his tie, rolling his eyes upward, letting the desperation in his voice do the work no other comic dared to attempt. And that's when it happened, not in one single explosive night, but gradually, set by set, until audiences started showing up specifically to see him. Carson's stage didn't just give Dangerfield exposure, it gave him a persona durable enough to build an entire career on, well into his 60s and 70s. The arc tells the rest of the story: a struggling club comic who spent years scraping by became, through repeated Tonight Show appearances, one of stand-up's most recognizable names, proof that Carson's stage could turn even a single recurring punchline into a permanent piece of American comedy. That's why audiences still quote him today, word for word, more than 3 decades after his breakthrough, because Rodney Dangerfield understood something most comedians never learn: sometimes the joke isn't the line. It's the 30 years of genuine disappointment sitting underneath it. But while Dangerfield proved persistence could build a career on Carson's couch, the next guest discovered that one single gesture from Johnny, wordless, 3 seconds long, could do the same thing instantly. On May 6, 1981, a 26-year-old stand-up named Jerry Seinfeld walked out onto the Tonight Show stage for the first time, doing observational material so clean and structured it barely sounded like comedy at all, just somebody explaining what was wrong with skiing, or volleyball, or the way people actually talk to each other. For most new comics, that was the whole transaction: do your 5 minutes, take the applause, walk off. Carson had a different, unspoken ritual reserved for the ones he genuinely liked. If a set landed well enough, he wouldn't just clap from behind the desk, he would wave the comedian over to sit down beside him. Seinfeld's material landed. And as the applause was still dying down, Carson gave him the wave. It might be the single most consequential 3 seconds in the history of stand-up comedy. Every comic working the circuit in the 1980s understood exactly what that gesture meant. Forget the club circuit, forget the local bookers, Johnny Carson had just told millions of viewers, without saying a word, that you were the real thing. For Seinfeld, the moment marked the beginning of a relationship with Carson's show that helped build him into one of the most trusted comic voices on television, years before a sitcom about nothing turned him into one of the wealthiest entertainers in the country. That single wave is still talked about among comedians the way actors talk about an Oscar nomination, not the prize itself, but proof that the prize is possible. That is precisely why people are still talking about it more than 4 decades later. But while Seinfeld earned his moment with a perfectly built joke, the next guest earned his with something Carson could never write into a script at all: pure, unmanufactured charisma. By the time Muhammad Ali sat down across from Johnny Carson, he had already spent a decade being the most famous talker in American sports, a heavyweight champion who could promote a fight, needle an opponent, and win over a room before he'd thrown a single punch. The Tonight Show stage should have belonged to Carson. Most nights, with most guests, it did. Not with Ali. He'd lean toward the camera mid-sentence, drop his voice to a conspiratorial murmur, then snap back into full showman volume, storytelling, trash talk, the occasional bit of sleight of hand, all stitched together with a charisma that matched Carson's own wit beat for beat. The studio audience didn't just laugh along with Ali's jokes, they reacted to him the way a crowd reacts to a fighter walking to the ring. And that's the detail Tonight Show historians keep coming back to. Carson, normally the one steering the conversation, would simply lean back and let Ali run the room. It wasn't a concession. It was Carson recognizing a rare kind of guest who didn't need to be interviewed so much as unleashed. Those Ali appearances are still remembered as some of the highest energy interviews of Carson's entire run, proof that the format could survive, even thrive, when the host briefly handed over control. That's why we're still watching them decades later, because Ali didn't just visit The Tonight Show. For those few minutes, he owned it. But while Ali represented something new, sports stardom crossing fully into late-night entertainment, the next guest represented the very thing that built the format in the first place. 6 decades of show business history walking through the same curtain, night after night. Bob Hope had been a star since before television existed in most American living rooms, vaudeville, radio, USO tours, a string of box office hits that made him one of the most recognized entertainers on the planet. By the time Johnny Carson took over the Tonight Show desk in 1962, Hope was already an institution, and over the next 3 decades, he returned to that desk again and again, appearance after appearance, across generations of audiences. What made Hope's recurring presence matter wasn't a single dramatic moment, it was the sheer continuity of it. A viewer who watched Hope's Bar with Carson in the 1960s could turn on the same show in the 1980s and find him still there, still sharp, still delivering the same effortlessly timed one-liners that had defined American comedy since before the war. And that's the role Hope quietly filled for 30 years, living connective tissue between the old guard of entertainment, the era of the big band orchestras and the studio system, and the new generation of comics that Carson was actively discovering and promoting on the very same stage. Audiences trusted Hope precisely because he never seemed to change, appearing decade after decade with the same straightforward, unhurried delivery while everything around him modernized. That's precisely why his appearances still matter to television historians today, not for a single viral moment, but for the simple fact that Bob Hope made The Tonight Show feel like a continuous, living thread connecting 2 entirely different eras of American entertainment. We've actually covered the full arc of Bob Hope's career, and the bridge it built between old Hollywood and the comedy boom of the 80s, in more depth elsewhere, but for now, there's one more guest on this list who never had to bridge anything at all, because he wasn't technically a person. On April 2, 1979, Johnny Carson took the night off, and NBC handed the entire 90 minutes of The Tonight Show over to Kermit the Frog. It sounds like a joke. It wasn't. Kermit opened with a full monologue, introduced guests including Vincent Price and Bernadette Peters, ran the desk interviews, and closed the broadcast with his own signature song before signing off by thanking the puppeteers working behind him. The whole thing was built to promote the upcoming release of The Muppet Movie, and audiences, expecting a stunt, got something closer to a genuinely competent broadcast. It remains one of the strangest chapters in the show's history, and one of the most fondly remembered, a reminder that Carson's Tonight Show was confident enough in its own format to hand the keys to a green felt amphibian for an entire night and trust the audience to go along with it. Most lists like this skip right past it. We're not going to. Because if a frog can guest host one of the most powerful programs on American television, it tells you something about exactly how strong the format Carson built really was. Now, back to the humans and the chaos that came with some of them. In May 1963, when The Tonight Show was still making its earliest trips out to Burbank, California, Marlon Brando agreed to make what would be his first ever appearance on a late-night talk show. He arrived visibly intoxicated and sat down beside the night's previous guest, socialite and actress Gabor, who had come on to promote a new face cream. For a few minutes, the two were almost warm with each other. Brando called Gabor charming, and Gabor seemed delighted to share the panel with one of Hollywood's biggest stars. Carson, sitting between them, had every reason to expect a smooth, pleasant segment. And that's when Gabor wouldn't let it stay smooth. She kept steering the conversation back toward her face cream, interrupting Brando's answers, talking over him whenever he tried to redirect. Brando told a flat knock-knock joke that drew only polite, scattered applause, and Gabor couldn't resist twisting the knife, telling him, only for Marlon Brando would they applaud for that. Brando, visibly irritated and still drunk, snapped back, asking whether they were going to spend the entire night listening to her sales pitch. The exchange spiraled fast into open insults between two of the biggest names in the room until Gabor stood up and walked off the set entirely, live, in front of the studio audience and the cameras, while Brando simply offered a sly, satisfied smile. It's considered one of the earliest viral-style moments in television history. Decades before the internet existed to make something viral, two celebrities had already managed it live, on tape, in front of millions. That's why clips of that exchange still circulate today. Whenever someone wants proof that even Hollywood's most controlled stars couldn't always control themselves once Carson's cameras were rolling. But if Brando and Gabor showed what could go wrong between two larger-than-life guests, the next entry on this list showed what happened when an entire network tried to decide who deserved Carson's chair after he was gone. From his earliest appearances in the late 1970s, David Letterman wasn't just another comedian working Carson's stage, he was someone Carson personally championed, inviting him back again and again as both a guest and, eventually, as one of his most trusted guest hosts. By the time the 1980s were underway, Letterman had built his own show in NBC's late-night lineup, and the assumption inside the industry was simple: when Johnny Carson finally retired, David Letterman would be the one to inherit the desk. Carson never publicly confirmed it. He didn't have to. The frequency of Letterman's guest hosting appearances, and Carson's evident comfort handing over his own show to him, said enough on their own. And that's when NBC made a different call entirely. As Carson's 1992 retirement approached, the network passed over Letterman in favor of Jay Leno, a decision built partly on years of Leno's own guest hosting, including a staggering 333 appearances sitting in for Carson, more than anyone else in the show's history. Letterman, blindsided by a decision many inside the industry had assumed was already settled, left NBC entirely and moved to CBS, launching a direct, fiercely competitive rival show that would battle Leno's Tonight Show for ratings supremacy for the next 2 decades. The fallout reshaped the entire structure of American late-night television, splitting one dominant franchise into 2 competing dynasties and setting the template for nearly every late-night succession drama that followed. That's why television historians still call it one of the most consequential decisions in the medium's history, not because of what happened on Carson's show, but because of the empire that rose out of what almost happened there instead. But for all the corporate drama of the Leno-Letterman succession, the most personal falling out in Tonight Show history wasn't a business decision at all. It was a phone call Johnny Carson never forgot and never forgave. Joan Rivers made her Tonight Show debut in 1965, and the appearance instantly changed her career, launching her from struggling club comic to a guest Carson kept inviting back for the next 2 decades. Rivers always credited him directly for the break, calling him, in her own words, the man who handed her her career. By 1983, that trust had grown into something larger. Carson named her the show's first ever permanent guest host, a role she would go on to fill more than 200 times. For years, Rivers turned down higher-paying offers from rival networks purely out of loyalty to Carson. But by the mid-1980s, cracks had started to form. NBC offered her only short-term contracts while quietly circulating a list of potential successors for when Carson eventually retired, and Rivers discovered, to her shock, that her name wasn't anywhere on it. And that's when Fox came calling, offering her something NBC never had: her own show, her own desk, the chance to become the first woman ever to host a network late-night program. Rivers said yes and decided to keep it from Carson until the deal was already done, afraid that if word leaked early, the offer might disappear. It didn't stay quiet for long. Carson learned about the Fox deal from a press release, not from Rivers herself. When she finally called him at home to explain, he picked up, listened to her tell him she had her own show on Fox, and hung up. She called back. He hung up again. He never spoke to her again. Not once, not for the rest of his life. Rivers' Fox show collapsed within a year, her husband died soon after, and Carson made sure she was effectively kept off The Tonight Show for as long as he and his immediate successor held the desk, a silence that lasted nearly 30 years, broken only when she finally returned to NBC's couch in 2014, almost a decade after Carson himself had died. It remains one of the most quietly devastating fallouts in television history, not a screaming match, not a public feud, just one unanswered phone call that ended a 20-year friendship permanently. That is precisely why people are still talking about it decades later, because it proved that the same loyalty Carson demanded from his closest guests could disappear in a single afternoon, the moment he felt it had been broken. But if Rivers' story showed how brutally an ending on The Tonight Show could land, the final guest on this list proved the opposite was just as possible, that an ending could be unbearably, beautifully gentle. On May 21, 1992, on the next-to-last episode of The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson, Bette Midler walked out for what everyone in the building already understood was an emotional, history-making night. After 3 decades, Carson was leaving the desk for good, and Midler, along with Robin Williams earlier in the same episode, had been chosen for the honor of being among his very last guests. She opened light, performing a comedic rewrite of a classic standard built specifically around Carson himself. The audience laughed. The mood stayed warm, affectionate, controlled. And that's when Carson, mid-conversation, mentioned almost in passing that "Here's That Rainy Day" had always been one of his favorite songs. Midler didn't wait for a cue. She simply started singing it, right there, unaccompanied at first, and a few lines in, Carson quietly began singing along with her, completely in tune, completely sincere, in front of an audience of tens of millions. The band picked it up. The room went still. And then Midler delivered the moment nobody who saw it has ever forgotten, a full, unguarded performance of "One for My Baby," and "One More for the Road," a torch song about closing time, about an ending nobody really wants, sung directly to the man on his way out the door. A cameraman caught something that had never been captured on the show before: Carson, chin resting on his hand, visibly tearing up as he watched her sing. The most composed man in American television, the host who had spent 30 years as everyone else's straight man, simply let the cameras see him feel it. Midler won an Emmy for the performance. Producers later admitted they seriously discussed whether the show could simply end right there, that the moment was too perfect to risk following with anything else. It remains, to this day, one of the most emotional pieces of farewell television ever broadcast. That is exactly why we're still watching it more than 3 decades later, because it proved that after 30 years of being the steadiest man in late night, all it took to finally crack Johnny Carson open was the right song, sung by the right person, at exactly the right moment. Over 30 years behind that desk, Johnny Carson welcomed tens of thousands of guests, helped build or accelerate the careers of dozens of comedians who would go on to define American comedy for the next half-century, among them Letterman, Seinfeld, Rivers, and Williams, 4 names from this very list, and turned a 5-night-a-week television program into something close to a national nightly ritual. By the time he handed back the desk in May 1992, more than 50 million people tuned in just to watch him say goodbye. And Carson, with that famous unshakable calm, made all of it feel effortless, when the truth was that his real gift was creating just enough space, night after night, for genuinely unscripted human beings to walk out from behind that curtain and simply be themselves, for better or for worse. He wasn't the funniest person on his own stage most nights, and he didn't need to be. He only needed to be the steadiest person in the room, so that everyone else felt safe enough to lose control of theirs. No format, no writer's room, and no amount of careful booking could have manufactured Robin Williams losing control of a room, or Joan Rivers losing a friendship over a single phone call, or Bette Midler making the most composed man on television cry on live TV. Those moments happened because Johnny Carson understood the one thing every great host eventually has to learn: sometimes the bravest thing you can do behind the desk is simply get out of the way and let the moment happen.